prosecuting judge in that case was later assassinated. This trial is another high-profile attempt by the Italian state to confront organized crime. It's expected to last at least 2 years. Simon McGregor-Wood, TRT World.
Now to the world of business with Oscar.
Bitcoin is continuing its wild ride as the cryptocurrency heads for its worst week since March last year. The world's biggest digital coin tumbled to a low of around $30,300 this week, just days after hitting a record high of nearly $42,000 on Friday. It's pared some of those losses and is sitting at around $34,000 right now, but the more than 20% drop means Bitcoin is now technically in a bear market. While it's still much higher than the sub $4,000 that it crashed to last March, this week's drop is raising questions about the outlook for the cryptocurrency boom. But Bitcoin bulls say the outlook is bright as more institutional investors sink their money into the asset and digital payments firms adopt the currency. For more on this and the broader markets, let's speak to Michael Hewson in London now. He's the Chief Market Analyst at CMC Markets. Great to have you back with us, Michael. Now, these wild swings in Bitcoin really do reinforce the volatile nature of this asset, but it's still sitting at near record highs. Can you tell us what's behind the most recent losses and how much lower or indeed higher could Bitcoin go?
I think that the last part of your question is probably the most difficult to answer, Oscar. But let's deal with the first part of it initially. I think one of the reasons why we saw the big sell-off from 42,000 was the Financial Conduct Authority here in the United Kingdom fired a timely reminder to investors that investing in Bitcoin was very high risk and that investors should be prepared to lose all of their money if they were to invest in what is still, I think, very much a speculative. I think it was a reminder, if any were needed, that Bitcoin, over the course of the past 4 or 5 years, has been very, very volatile. It's not a particularly liquid market and is prone to these sorts of moves. We've only got to go back to 2017 when Bitcoin hit a record high then of just below $20,000 a unit. Now, one of the reasons we broke higher was on the 16th of December, we broke through $20,000 and we've ratcheted quite a bit higher to $42,000. So in less than a month, Bitcoin doubled in price. So there was always going to be a counter reaction. The big question now is, where do we go from here? And I would argue that the bullish case for Bitcoin has not gone away. The volatility case for Bitcoin has not gone away. So for me, I still think Bitcoin has a potential to go an awful lot higher. And for all of those people who are saying it's in a bubble, well, so were a lot of things, like the crypto bubble, like the dot-com bubble in 2000. And we're now an awful lot higher now than we were then.
Okay, let's look at stock markets now. The movements there are nowhere near as wild at the moment. In fact, they're a bit flat in some parts of the world. Can you tell us what's weighing on investors' minds right now?
I think it's more an element of caution than anything else. We got off to a real flyer at the beginning of this year after those 2 Georgia seats flipped to the Democrats, and that prompted an awful lot of speculation that we were going to see a significant fiscal response from a new US Biden administration. Now, with the spike in yields that we've seen subsequently and the slide in the dollar, some of the froth has come off that rebound. Now, that's not to say that we can't go higher, but ahead of more detail on the Biden plan, the Biden fiscal plan, investors are now playing a little bit of a waiting game as we look ahead to next week's inauguration and more detail, I think, more broadly about the Democrats' fiscal plans going forward.
Okay, Michael Hewson from CMC Markets, always a pleasure. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now to other top stories from around the world. Turkey's industrial production jumped 11% from a year ago in November, marking the 6th consecutive month of growth. That's as the economic recovery picked up pace after the initial loosening of coronavirus restrictions. Meanwhile, retail sales also surged 12% in the same month, driven by a jump in online purchases as people continued to stay at home during the pandemic. European food delivery app Just Eat Takeaway has reported a 57% jump in fourth quarter orders from the same period in 2019. That's as restaurants were forced to go online after countries across Europe reimposed lockdowns. In June, the company agreed to buy US rival Grubhub for $7.3 billion to create the biggest food ordering service outside of China. And Telefonica has agreed to sell its mobile phone masts to US telecom infrastructure operator American Towers for $9.4 billion. The deal comes as part of the Spanish telecom company's efforts to cut its debt pile of around $45 billion, which is one of the biggest in the industry. Shares in Telefonica jumped around 10% on the news. And that is the latest business and finance news for now.
Now let's take a look at some stories from around the world that have caught our eye in Behind the Headlines. First, let's go back to our lead story. President Trump has been labelled a clear and present danger to America. As the Washington Post reports, he's poised to become the first US leader to be impeached twice. The Indy Star reports that the only female inmate on federal death row in the US has been executed for murder. Lisa Montgomery received a lethal injection at a prison in Indiana. Her case attracted attention because her lawyers argued she was mentally ill and suffered serious abuse as a child. A tragic landmark here in the UK as the number of COVID deaths reaches a new daily high of over 1,500. The Guardian reports the death toll has now passed the 100,000 mark and warns the next couple of weeks are likely to be the most deadly of the pandemic so far. And finally, on the eve of the Ugandan elections, Africa News says the country's longtime ruler, Yoweri Museveni, has reacted to reports of intimidation and violence in the campaign by saying, "We don't need lectures." Museveni is facing a serious electoral challenge from the singer-turned-politician Bobi Wine. And here with me to review all of these stories are former journalist and author Gary Hudson and South African journalist Varashni Pillai. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining us on Behind the Headlines today. So going back to that ongoing developing story in the United States, the impending impeachment vote on President Trump. Gary, why do you think this path is being pursued with only a week to go of his presidency?
Well, it does look like his presidency is going to end not with a bang, as we were looking at just a week ago when all his supporters stormed the Capitol, but with a whimper because the Senate, even if they decide to impeach, won't get down to doing the proceedings until the day before Joe Biden takes office. So any legal proceedings in the impeachment will take place after he's finished being president, by the look of it. That's because Mike Pence obviously refused to adopt the 25th Amendment option and to take over from the president on the grounds of his mental incapacity. So the reason they're doing it is because the Democrats have had enough. And the outrage last week was palpable across Republicans as well, when President Trump finally, well, you can't say finally flipped, I'm being unfair there, because he's been pretty unhinged all the way through. But when his mental capacity really came into question over that whole business of the storming of the Capitol.
And Varashni, it is extremely unlikely that there will be a big enough majority to convict him, but there is growing support for it even from Republicans.
That has been probably the most astonishing thing. Although, as Gary has said, it's astonishing that it's taken this long, perhaps so many to have seen how bad this presidency has been. But the number of Republican senators who've come forward saying that if it did come to the Senate, they would vote for impeachment has grown, even though some of them have received, threats against for doing so. But they've stood firm to say that they believe that this really was a crime against the Constitution and the country, which it really was. Now, of course, as Gary has said, it is not much of a defeat or a big way to end Trump's presidency because of the timing of when the Senate resumes. But what we have to keep in mind is that it's important to do this impeachment, if only not just to end his current presidency, but to prevent him from running again in 2024. So I think it's worth it for the Democrats and some Republicans to at least try, if not to end the presidency, to prevent this from happening again.
And Gary, Mitch McConnell, though, has said within the last hour or so that he won't recall Senate early to kind of get this underway. So it looks like any trial will impinge on the start of Joe Biden's presidency. That's probably not how he wants to get things started.
No, it will be a distracting sideshow. That's what I was saying earlier. It looks like it'll be the day before Joe Biden actually takes over. But I think Russians got it actually hit it right on the head, because it's important that Trump isn't allowed to stand again, because it was clear from the events of last week that there's still a sizable proportion of the American public that are behind him, and it's a dangerous proportion of that public.
But before we get to the inauguration on January the 20th, Varashni, there are also concerns that scenes like we saw last Wednesday could potentially in some form be repeated, with threats of violence in the US.
Absolutely, Robin. And, I was quite disturbed to see certain posters being circulated on Twitter in dark corners of the internet, calling for people to gather and, again, defend their democracy. But thankfully, this time we're seeing security take it far more seriously. And we're hearing how Capitol security forces are really doubling and even tripling their forces to ensure that they can adequately deal with it this time, as they seemed completely caught unawares last time, despite the many hints from his supporters that this was going to happen.
Well, staying in the US, and we have the first woman to be executed by the federal government for 67 years. And Gary, this almost didn't happen. Why has it gone ahead?
Well, because, let's face it, this is part of the same story we've just been discussing, because it's Trump's legacy of death, really, because the Supreme Court gets involved. And as we know, he's appointed people to that Supreme Court, which give it a majority of right-wingers, pro-death penalty advocates, people like Amy Coney Barrett, who he forced through, despite the convention that they should have awaited the new presidential inauguration. And now we find ourselves in a situation where what's been described as a blitz of federal people on death row is occurring in the United States. People are being executed. This is by the federal authorities, not by the state authorities, in unprecedented numbers, something like a dozen or so in the last 7 months. And there hadn't been any since 2003 under George W. Bush. And then there were only 3 that year. But Trump has got this kind of bloodlust to kill off people on death row. And she's one of the unfortunate victims. It's always a dance macabre around these events, because there are last-minute stays and last-minute appeals for all sorts of courts. And that happened with her. But of course, she's just missed out by a couple of weeks, because Joe Biden certainly would not have executed her if it had still been ongoing at that stage.
And Varashni, as Gary suggests there are actually more executions scheduled in the coming days.
Absolutely, Robin. And to be honest, I find it incredibly difficult to read these stories, and you get these blow-by-blow accounts of how these people are dying. And to think that this is happening in a presidency when other presidents have not done this, have chosen not to do this. It's incredible. It is, as Gary has said, a certain kind of bloodlust. It's a signal to a certain kind of radicalized support base about where Trump stands and what he's willing to do to, quote unquote, I guess, stand up for them in their so-called principles. And the scary thing is the kind of dynamics of how these deaths have been planned. Initially, the first people to get to death row were white men, because the administration understood that the Black inmates and that the woman would cause such an uproar. So it was almost stage managed to cause less uproar and then do the really sensitive cases last. And one of them was Brandon Bernard, who was involved in a very a very unfortunate crime in his youth. And there was a huge pressure to overturn that execution, including from his former jurors. Some of them who put him in prison came out to say they felt that that was unfair, that it was driven by racism, and yet, the authorities still went ahead and did that. And I think it's just a terrible, terrible legacy.
And Gary, this case also complicated by the fact that Lisa Montgomery is said to have very serious mental health problems.
Well, that was the reason for the appeals against her execution. Obviously, those appeals failed, but she was seriously abused as a child, and she wasn't really in a fit state, so we learn now, to have pleaded at a trial, or indeed when she committed it, what was a terrible crime, but it was something which she probably didn't have much control over because of her background. All of this is bringing into focus for us on this side of the pond the horrors of the American judicial system, really. And I mean, it's probably a bit taking a step out of turn, but can I recommend a book, Surviving Execution by Ian Woods, who's a journalist who's a contributor to this very slot on TRT World.
We've just been speaking to him in the last half an hour, Gary.
Have you really? It's phenomenal. That book is just amazing. Surviving Executions, and it's about his relationship with a guy on death row. But it goes into all the pros and cons of how they do it over there and why they do it, and it's barbaric, quite frankly.
Well, let's move on to coronavirus, and we're going to stay with you, Gary, because I want to talk about UK cases first. They're at a new record high, and this would seem to be as a result in the relaxation of the rules over Christmas. And really, we were warned this was going to happen.
Yeah, it was predictable. It was predicted, in fact. And now we find ourselves with the worst daily death toll, 1,564, and the total in the country as a whole topping 100,000 deaths. It's absolutely horrific. The only ray of hope is, of course, the vaccination being wheeled out at pace. And despite some reports of difficulty in distribution of the vaccine, I can say that I actually took my own mother, who's 91, to one of the mass vaccination centres, the one in Birmingham at Millennium Point yesterday. And that was incredibly efficient, terribly well run. And we were in and out in next to no time, and everything was done very properly and very efficiently. I only hope that's being repeated around the country.
I'm pleased to hear that, Gary. There's quite a lot of people to get through, of course. And Varashini, in South Africa, where you are, there's also an enormous surge, largely because of this other variant, which is said to be more resistant to vaccines.
I mean, isn't that interesting that the UK and South Africa have that in common? We both had this new variant pop up around similar times, and the unfortunate forerunners with that. But yeah, absolutely, we have seen our essentially outstrip our first peak, and that has been frightening for a lot of us, because unlike developed countries, we cannot afford to shut down the economy again. It just created such economic carnage the first time that there just isn't room to do it again. It would cause like literal just, hunger and starvation. We just cannot do it again. It was terrible. But the fact is that just like in the rest of the world, there's COVID fatigue. People are tired, and, understandably so. But at the same time, there is a callousness, a disregard for rules that is kind of unacceptable. I think on both sides of our countries, there has been some failures in leadership and some failures in terms of policies. But I think there are some real concerns on our